Hello and welcome to Claigan's webinar on Restricted Materials 2020. More importantly, what do you need to do in 2020? So we're not talking specifically, well, there are some of it, about the restrictions in 2020. We're talking more about the work that needs to happen for restricted materials compliance in 2020. So this wanders into restrictions now, restrictions in 2021, and some newer ones likely coming into place in 2022. So give you an idea what to work on. It's a very full agenda. The concept is to be 50 minutes and hopefully get questions at the end. If you have any questions, feel free to submit them in the question bar and I'll get to as many as possible. But there is a lot of material. So I'm going to be going along at a pretty decent, fast clip. On the bright side, everybody who registered will receive a copy of the presentation and will have a downloadable record of the recording on our website. And we should have a YouTube version where you can scroll down the speed to 70% so you can make sense of me and my mom can finally understand me, which is somewhat useful. So, but I'm going to go quickly. There's a lot of material on the bright side. There are reference slides and you'll get copies. We're going to go through a lot of things. So we're going to talk about a lot of restricted materials deadlines. It says REACH SVHC Database at the top, which is a big chunk of it, but it's a huge number of things. We're going to be talking about 2020 to 2022 deadlines. We'll be talking a lot about the SCIP database because there's lots of misinformation and questions about that one. A bit of a reminder of it, but a lot more detail. We're going to be talking about the SVHC updates you have to make for some of the new lists and what the key chemicals are and why. We're going to talk about a newer REACH/POP restriction for PFOA. We'll explain. EU MDR, which is coming up in May of this year, its compliance deadline. RoHS 3, which is in for phthalates, which is already in place for regular products, but it's a requirement for any medical devices or monitoring control instruments imported after July of next year. And then we'll talk some upcoming Canadian ones. So in North America, a lot of people put focus on TSCA, and TSCA has this list of priority substances. But this is a list of priority substances to do a consultation, to evaluate whether or not they should spend effort on each individual one to figure out whether they should do anything about it. It's a long way away. So most of prohibitions you're going to see, or restrictions you're going to see in North America at a federal level are going to come out of Canada, and we'll explain that. There are a whole bunch coming up. And then we'll have a little section for Q&A. So if you have questions put in the question panel. I'll try to get to as many as possible. We had tons this morning, and I'll see what I can do. So first, the regulatory timeline. We did one of these last year. And we just passed the UAE phase, whether it's phthalates for regular products or just the initial UAE registration for medical and monitoring control. So May of this year, EU MDR kicks in. Now, it's a bit of a complexity. If you have a legacy product with a valid medical device directive certificate, you have until that certificate expires for that product. But in general, it kicks in May of 2020. We'll talk about that. There's the PFOA restriction that kicks in July for all products, with a few exceptions. Then the main SCIP database, the Substance of Concern database, which we'll talk about a lot off the bat, kicks in Jan 5th, 2021. And then the ROH restriction for phthalates, medical and monitoring control, come in middle or July of 2021. And then middle to late 2022, you're going to see some new stuff where the actual deadline is a little bit vague. Cobalt is being reclassified as a carcinogen, and it's a matter of publication. Unless something changes, and we'll discuss that, cobalt will be regulated under EU MDR late 2022, which brings into scope currently virtually all stainless steel. And then Canadian prohibitions, the first set of new ones should kick in by the end of 2022. Plus, every 6 months, you're going to have REACH SVHC updates. We'll talk a bit about those. So a lot of stuff going on, but I'm going to talk a lot more specifically. So first off, SCIP, Substance of Concern in Articles as Such or in Complex Objects Products. Kind of a messy acronym brought to you by the same people who had the acronym REACH, which believe it or not has a second R in it, restriction, and CORAP, which the little O is just thrown in there to pretend the word isn't what it is. If you have a product that has an SVHC above 0.1% by weight in any component, it has to be registered in the EU CLID database by Jan 5th, 2021. The playground version should be available soon, and the real version should be available in October. Now, that's the submission. The submission is relatively easy. Once you've got the data, the submission is just about putting the right data in the right fields. There's a lot of work to do. So imagine if you ever say a refrigerator that has a component, so this one will say a brass component, that has an SVHC, in this case lead, above 0.1% by weight, lead and brass around 3%. then the product and each component with an SVHC above 0.1% by weight has to be entered in the database. So the fridge, the brass component, the fact that it's lead, that we pull down menu to say percentage, which is 1 to 5%. You have to say material type, which is really metal. It's not really copper metal alloy, it's actually brass, is the real designation. And then the safe use instructions. Same thing, you have a silicone washer. Silicone is made from siloxanes. D6 is used to make silicone. Virtually all silicone rubber has D6 in it, just depending on the polymerization, the curing of how much D6 it has, whether it's hundreds of ppm or thousands. So we'll say in this case, the D6 is just about 0.1% by weight. It's in a thermoset plastic, which is silicone. So since you have the D6 in silicone and the lead in brass, you have to register A, the fridge, B, the brass component and attach it to the fridge, and C, the silicone washer and attach it to the fridge. And that's at a visual representation what you have to enter. Now, where are SVHCs commonly found? There's a lot of them that are super common, in particular lead metal, brass, aluminum, steel alloys, any of them that needs to be machined that normally have lead in them. They have exemptions in RoHS 6C, 6B, and 6A, but also high temp solder, which is many transistors, which is 7A. All of them are metal alloy. This doesn't include lead glasses. That's actually not a REACH SVHC. So the lead oxide, theoretically, which is really leaded glass in a thick film resistor, is not lead from an SVHC point of view. We'll talk about that one more later. You have all the different phthalates, which if you're RoHS 3 compliant, you're not supposed to have. Wires and cables, PVC, neoprene, nitrile. But a lot of people still do. And where it comes, phthalates and both SCCPs. Now, SCCPs are banned in Europe and banned in Canada. We'll talk about that again a little bit later. You cannot have it. And twist ties commonly have both. Now, twist ties are not under scope of RoHS, but they are under scope of REACH SVHC and under scope of POP, persistent organic pollutant. So the SCCP and a twist tie can cause a product recall issue. And about 1 in 3 twist ties we see have it. It's pretty darn common. Nobody really controls twist ties. They're mostly flexible PVC with phthalates and SCCPs. Buzzers and transducers are often piezo. So you have piezo lead zirconate titanate. It's allowed. You just have to declare it. Non-woven fiber, Kapton, spandex, elastane, lycra, and Nomex. So Nomex is often a little white waxy paper you see in a power supply. They're made with DMAC, and they often have over 1,000 ppm DMAC residual. You have mocha, which is cast polyurethane, so like sort of the hard caster wheels in a cart. And then the siloxanes, the building blocks of silicone. So silicone is made from D6. So depending on the curing process, whether you're above or below 1,000 ppm depends heavily on the curing. If you look at the safety data sheet, if it's accurate, it will actually normally have D6 well above 0.1% by weight. It's just a question of whether it's cured. Button cell batteries have EGDME. It's part of the electrolyte. It's pretty normal. It's allowed. It's just declarable. Then there's ADCA. ADCA is very common material. So when you make bread and you put yeast in it, and the yeast eats the sugars and releases little carbon dioxide bubbles and causes the bread to bubble. You think people would say, hey, look, the bread is rising. It's actually foaming. More technical term is foaming. It's putting little bubbles in it, and it's foaming, which is what the bread is rising. The little carbon dioxide bubbles produced from the yeast eating the sugars cause the bread to rise. And then you cure the bread. You put it into the oven and you bake it or cure it. And then the bubbles are baked in. Closed cell plastic foam is very similar. So an open cell foam is a little bit different. So if the chair is sitting on probably is a little bit of a cushion. If you so gauche, you could get down and blow through it and the air will pass right through your cushion. That's open cell. Closed cell foam are like polyethylene pool noodles. When you bring it up to your face and try to blow it, you just go blue in the face. But there are bubbles in it. The cells, though, are closed. And how that works is they use ADCA. The ADCA, when it gets hot and wet, decomposes and releases both nitrogen and carbon dioxide and creates bubbles in the polyethylene, which causes it to foam or rise. Then they cure it, basically bake it. They cure the foam, and all those little pockets, bubbles, are all baked in. And that's made using ADCA, and there's still usually quite a bit residual. That's why it's the third most enforced REACH SVHC right now, the ADCA. In the enforcement project by the European countries in 2018, it came up third. It's very, very common. TNPP, which is has been a common antioxidant for hot melt thermoplastics. So thermoplastics are plastics that can be remelt, like ABS and PVC, and so on and so forth. If they're light colored, they often use an antioxidant, so they don't discolor during melting. And TNPP is one of the substances that can do that. And theoretically, PFBS, which is a January 2020 SVHC. However, manufacturers basically said when you add it to polycarbonate as the flame retardant, it fully reacts and there's very little residual left over. And we've done testing, and our testing agrees it's fully reactive. So PFBS really isn't the risk it states here, but the rest are very, very common. So again, you have to take if the fridge has a component with leaded brass or one of those SVHCs from the previous page, the fridge has to go in there, and then each component that has an SVHC, its material type, how often how many instances are there, the SVHC, the concentration range, and then the relative safe use instruction. A safe use instruction is really complicated. There is a guidance, and the guidance is really not very helpful. It's more like a guidance counselor than guidance. It's basically say, look, you shouldn't use must wear protective equipment unless you think you should. Thanks. It's very circular. It doesn't really lay out right ways. It does. It hand waves, so you really should look at stuff and do it right, which is so helpful. But there is a guidance. What we normally do is every single SVHC is registered in the EU, and inside the registration will be safe use instructions for the chemical. Now, the safe use instruction for the chemical will go over all the different instances of the chemical itself, in particular inhalation. In most cases, your problem is contact. So you really need safe use instruction around the fact that people touch it, then touch their mouth and ingest it. So we're looking around safe use instructions around contact, washing hands after contact, keep it out of reach of children, and don't throw it out. Electronics are governed by we anyways. So what we do is we take phrases, the applicable phrases from the chemical registration, and use them. For a bioaccumulant, it's quite different. So D6 is not a reproductive toxin or carcinogen. It's a bioaccumulant. Therefore, it's all around disposal. Don't throw it in the municipal waste stream. Don't flush or pour down the toilet. One of the most common sources of D6 is quite funny, is moisturizer or hair conditioner. So for some years, for some time, moisturizer no longer moisturizes your hands. What it does, your skin, it covers your skin in a silicone gel, either dimethicone, which is a code name for silicone gel, or D6, which is also dimethicone, or the D5 version, the pentasiloxane. And it coats your skin or hair in a silicone gel and keeps the water in. And so its main use, if you have sitting there at your desk and you have a moisturizer, flip it around at your desk and see if it says cyclopentasiloxane or it says dimethicone, which is the code word for silicone gel. That's its main use. But D6 is the building block of silicone rubber. It'll often be cured away, but not fully. It just depends what concentration's there. But it's a bioaccumulant. So the fact it's not a moisturizer doesn't hurt you. That's one of the reasons why it's used. It's not a human issue because it doesn't react with you. But it doesn't really react with much. So it bioaccumulates in the environment until it causes harm. So the way we normally do things is everybody's looking at what goes, the database. Hold your horses. Once you have the data, the database is not a big deal. But you need to organize the data. You need to get it and organize it. So we often do it in a spreadsheet. Now, I normally use Google Sheets because it's multi-stakeholder, but think of it as Excel. Excel is fine. And we organize it where each column is a different product. And this way it gives us, once we're doing Excel, it's a lot easier to work in and nothing's written in stone. We can move stuff around, we can copy paste, we can merge products together, we can separate products. It's really much easier than working in the database. So we work first in an Excel spreadsheet. There's a lot of work to be done. And the database isn't up until October, but there's a lot of work to be done in between. So what you really need, the mandatory fields, what's the name of the product? And you can name it pretty well anything you want. And one of the biggest complexity, people go, look, you have to enter 100,000 parts, give 100,000 SKUs. No, what you normally do is you enter it at a data sheet level that encompasses a lot of products. So if you made resistors, for example, you wouldn't register every single size and resistance value resistor. You'd register the CK11 resistor family. So what's the name? And if you're concerned that people might not know what that means, you can put a second field in that actually describes the models covered. Company, so you're going to get two IUCLID numbers. IUCLID's the database. One is the ID number for the company registering. So it has to be an EU country, but it can be one of your arms. It could be a distributor. It doesn't matter. It has to have an EU address. They register in the system. They get a number. And then when the product's registered, it'll eventually get a number. And often when your supplier asks for your Euclid information or your SCIP registration, you give them your number. So there'll be a number for the company and a number for the product. Then you need a unique identifier. So it says UPC code here. That's one of many in a pull down. Could be an individual UPC code, could be a model number, could be a part number, could be a family. You have, as long as you're honest, and this declaration covers them and declares that at a component level, then that's allowed. You're following your REACH SVHC rules. You need to have an article category, which is either one of two things. It's either the customs code, or if it's a straight material like brass, it has to be the material type, which is metal-brass, is one of the pull-down menus. So almost everything here actually has options. Like UPC code is actually a pull-down menu all by itself. You can actually pull it down and get all of its options. You have to enter whether it's made in the EU, which you can say, yes, it is, no, it's not, or withheld, we're not going to say. And then you have to put its safe use instructions. Now, because all the SVHCs are at the component level, we normally say see component safe use instructions because they're at the component level. Then you just have to link every component that has an SVHC in it. So in Excel, we list all the component types we build because you have to build a brass component product also to link to it. So we just write down each one of the component types it has with an SVHC in it and how many of each it has. Some it has 0. Well, that's fine. We can change our mind. Or as you work on things, you see the twist tie has 1 there. Twist ties are poorly controlled. You might fix that problem so the twist tie no longer has phthalates, and then you can reduce it to 0. This is a working space. This is not the database yet. This is a working space. Once you get this part solved, putting in the database is relatively straightforward. So when you get their products, you also have to create the components. Now you can use the same components over and over again. You can attach brass components to each one of these products. Each one of these products attaches to it, that's fine. So for the brass components, you have to give it a name, you have to give it a part number, but if it's your part, you can call that brass components anything you feel like. And then you have to use the customs code, and brass components have one, or you can use brass metal, which is metal, copper, metal alloy. Is it produced in the EU? Yes, no, or unwilling to disclose. And it's a component, so it could be from anywhere. So we say unwilling to disclose. The safe use instructions, and this is not an atypical one for lead, but there are other options, and we haven't necessarily finalized what we're using. Which candidate list you most recently used. So we've updated this. This part was evaluated the July 2019 list. You see above it, we have an optional field. Some companies like to separate where their SVHCs are internal or external. So if you make a blender, often, I have a lead part, people go, oh no, you have lead. You want to say something like it's inside. A lot of companies want to say it's inside, or it's not food contacting, or something to that effect. That's an optional field. There's lots of optional fields. What SVHC list was most recently updated to? The SVHC. This one's lead. It's a pull-down menu. There's a pull-down menu for concentration ranges, one of which is 0.1 to 100%, because legally you only have to say it's above 0.1, but lead's at 3%, so we see 1 to 10%. And then the materials category, metal, copper, metal alloy. It's actually the really official. The new pull-down is metal-brass. And so each one of these components is connected to the upper product. So the upper product doesn't have SVHCs. It just connects to the lower components that have them. And we normally put all the different options together and how many of each it has. One of the reasons is also if we decide to split one up or merge them together in this worksheet, it's a lot easier if they're all using the same rows. Now, in terms of accuracy, we do a tremendous amount of testing in the REACH SVHC side, over 200,000 parts and products. When a supplier declares an SVHC in a part, they say, yes, we have an SVHC in this part above 0.1%. About 50% of the time, they're right. A lot of reasons for that. Some is definitional issues, like leaded glass is not an SVHC. But a lot of other times, the SVHC does not exist in the final form, TGIC in paint, and a variety of others. D6 gets polymerized away in many cases. Or they're just completely wrong, which is very common. We've had one the other day saying, we want to know how much phthalates are in this PVC, and we get it, and it's not even PVC. That's not abnormal. So when a supplier says, yes, we have an SVHC, usually with lead and brass, they're correct. Not all the time. Most of the time. Other than that, they're not usually that correct. It's just, so even if a supplier says, yes, I have an SVHC in it, there's a variety of things in this. That part may have had an SVHC, but the newer versions don't, but they still declare the SVHC. There's a lot of, it's actually quite surprising how wrong the supplier SVHC's declarations are. They often say, hey, this sticker has this SVHC, and we test it. Because we like to test real world samples all the time. So if somebody says, hey, we have this, we'll go and test it. Because to get the accuracy up in the tests, using control samples is great and all, but having real world samples is vastly superior. They help deal with unforeseen problems. And more than half the time, it doesn't have it. Now, if we find an SVHC, about half the time, this is 40% of the time, but about half the time, the supplier is not aware that it was there. Now, lead and brass are usually more cognizant, but very, very often they didn't declare it. If we get assembly, say, hey, we find lead and brass, and they didn't declare it. Phthalates. With phthalates, also have the problem of the phthalates coming in through the dye, the colorant, as opposed to primary plastic. That's often not discovered. But when a supplier says, when we get an SVHC, we measure it 50% of the time the supplier didn't. It says above 40, but about 50% of the time, the supplier didn't declare it. Now, it doesn't mean that SVHCs are there all the time. SVHCs are relatively rare on a per part count, but over a complicated product like a piece of electronics, there's almost always many SVHCs in that product. And the supplier data, when they say there's one, they're wrong about half the time. And when we find one, they didn't declare it about half the time. So it's a bit of a crapshoot. And it's funny, when we do data gathering, also the parts most likely to have SVHCs often don't have data. Lead and brass a little bit different, but everything else, we got all the data, but not for the twist tie. Well, guess where the phthalates and SCCPs are most likely to be the twist tie. About 1 in 3 twist ties is SCCPs, which is a recall issue. It's neat. A lot of things are controlling the BOM, but the twist tie is often not. You buy a cord, nobody takes into account the twist tie. It's still part of REACH. It's not part of RoHS, but it's part of REACH. It's part of POP. Okay, recommendations. Now, I'm going a bit fast. One, because a lot of material to cover. And I want to get to questions at the end. But please, if you have questions, please submit it in the control panel under questions, and I'll try to get to as many as I can. Recommendations start now. It'll take a lot longer than you think to put everything together to do a submission. It isn't just the REACH data, which is a big part of it. You're going to have, many cases, stakeholder buy-in. Now, some of your stakeholders in a company might not care at all, but this is going to be publicly accessible, and there are often people that want to look at it. Think of what you're going to say about safe use instructions, or they're going to look at, what's that one? We said people have to wear gloves to touch your product. Do we really need that material in it? Can we do something about it? If you don't have the data together early, you can't fix it. You can find twist tie says, oh, look, this twist tie says people that use our product will get reproductive harm. If we knew 2 months ago, we probably got to change that twist tie, not have to declare it. So start now. It makes a big difference. You also find when people work with us, we should do one first. People get used to what it looks like and goes, oh, that's what we're doing. Makes life so much easier for everybody. And they can show their own stakeholders and managers saying, this is what we're trying to do here. This is a real one. It makes life, instead of this, we're putting in a database hypothetical thing. Don't panic, but don't let it slip. There's lots of misinformation out there. Oh my goodness, what we get on a daily basis, just people want to sell you things. It's one of the truths in this business. There's a lot of misinformation out there. The work is straightforward, but there is work to do. That's the key part. From a technical perspective, we have this. Your biggest problem, especially working with us, is not going to be the technical side. We've got that. It's going to be some of the stakeholder negotiations. We're saying, okay, what are we going to say about customs code? And nobody can agree about customs code. Lovely. Now, often people can figure it out, or there is somebody who knows. But it's often we want to say this or safe use instructions. Everybody good? And getting 5 or 10 people all agree about the same thing is sometimes always exciting. Or you're going to find products you didn't think of. Oh, I forgot about this. And a lot of products, like we won the other day, hey, look, we have a mixer. Mixer's awesome. The carrying bag they put in the package with it, not awesome. That's the declaration. This isn't good. And they have to look at that. And they also realize, while we're doing that, that's actually a Prop 65 issue. We should have noticed that. So there's a lot of work to do. It's straightforward. Don't panic. It's straightforward, point A to point B, but there is work to get from point A to point B. And work with an expert. When things are complicated and new, everyone tries to sell you something. Hey, look, we have this deadline. Panic, panic, panic. Use our solution. It'll magically make it work. Okay, we're the experts in this. We're not salespeople. It's funny, I don't, if anybody's interacted with us, whether or not you've ever dealt with a salespeople, because you will normally, the plan is you will interact with somebody who is technically versed in this and does this work. We'd rather have you talking with somebody who can talk about your product than sales. We actually want to get you compliant. We're also very much in the long haul. We have basically all of our customers from week one, month one when we started. We're not looking, this is compliance, especially restricted materials, is changing. It's year over year, it's new products. It's much more important for us to focus on your compliance than, say, a sales commission for the end of the month. It's not in everybody's best interest, and particularly yours. So we're really good at this. When in doubt, contact, even if you just have questions. And somebody says, hey, look, I've got this product family. I have 15,000 SKUs. How am I going to do this? Here, this is what other people are doing. This is how you divide it up. And this is how you start. Now, when you start doing a SCIP, you're also going to realize often that people have created REACH SVHC declarations, hopefully, and they may be out of date by now, which happens. That is the best of us. One of the problems with REACH SVHC, once you create one, updating it often becomes a mañana thing where you're going to do it tomorrow, and there's always another tomorrow, and it just keeps kind of wandering this way. So by the time you update it, put it in the SCIP database, you will at least have to be updated to the 2019 list, if not the January 2020 list. It's not written yet, but it's basically you'll have 1 year to update your SCIP declarations every time a REACH SVHC list changes. So the big one from 2019 is TNPP, trisonyl phenyl phosphide. It's an antioxidant. It's on there because it usually has up to 0.1% or more 4-NP, which is an SVHC in its own right. It's an antioxidant. It's used to stabilize light-colored thermoplastics. Thermoplastics are plastics you can melt and remelt, and it's really for hot melt. So polyethylene, PVC, ABS. I'm not sure SPR counts as that. I'll double check. These are plastics that when you melt, you can remelt. So on the opposite side, santoprene, silicone are normally thermoset, and you can't do them twice. So it's used commonly in that for light color to prevent color change and other issues during heat melt. Now, the neat thing about it is the reason TNPP is in there because of its 4-NP composition. In reality, what happens when once we found out about this substance was being under consultation, we went out and got product or materials that have TNPP in them. Not just got control samples, real world samples that the plastic manufacturer says, hey, we use TNPP. And what we found to do testing is the TNPP heavily decomposes into 4-NP. So often, in many cases, by the end of the day, we have more 4-NP, which is an SVHC, than we have TNPP. It's kind of a strange situation where if the SVHC decomposes into another SVHC, and it's the other SVHC that ends up being declared. So often you get TNPP, you end up with 4-NP in the end. And it's not an uncommon situation. Now, plastic companies are more and more using twins to TNPP, not the current version, but it is an antioxidant for thermoplastics, and it could be in virtually any hot melt plastic. So not silicone and not santoprene and such, but definitely PVC and polyethylene and ABS and polyurethane and a whole bunch of others. So when you update it, do realize this one's quite prevalent. But often, even though you have to be updated within the last year, sometimes people have let it slip a little bit. So in 2018, there are two other sets of really, really common SVHCs, lead and the D4, D5, D6 siloxanes. The 5, 6, 7 is really how many silicons they have in the siloxane ring. Lead metal is added. Lead oxide was there previously, lead metal is added now. So this is lead powder massive, which means lead metal. Lead and lead as in metal alloy. So lead and brass, lead and aluminum, lead and steel, lead and high temp solder are all in scope. They're all of RoHS exemptions for electronics, 6A, 6B, 6C, and 7A. And they're allowed. They just have to be declared now. But leaded glass, like a thick film resistor, is not lead metal and it's not lead oxide. It's a different chemical and not declarable as a REACH SVHC. So you're looking at lead in metal alloys, brass, aluminum, steel, high temp solder, which almost virtually every single complicated piece of electronics has them, whether it's in the prong, the standoff, the connector, the transistors for high temp solder, super, super common. So this one SVHC is the leading reason why, especially electronics, have declarable SVHCs. But this other one's pretty common too. This is cyclosiloxanes, particularly D6, which is the most common. It's a bioaccumulant. It's used to make silicone rubber. Of course, its other main use is and under the name of dimethicone too, as a silicone rubber gel. Silicone gel covers your skin or hair. So if you get your hair conditioner, if you go home, pick up your hair conditioner, flip it around, you'll probably see dimethicone or pentasiloxane, which is D5. It coats your skin or hair with silicone rubber, which lets air through but traps water in. So basically, you're coating yourself with silicone. The challenge is it's harmless to you, but it gets out in the environment, and the silicone coats everything else and doesn't biodegrade. So silicone rubber is made normally from D6. There's an excerpt from a safety data sheet down, very common silicone manufacturer there. The data sheet has the D6 cyclohexacyloxane between 0.5 and 1%. Most of it gets cured away when they cure the silicone, but not all of it. And so it's whether or not above 0.1% is a big question for each silicone part. It's a pretty common declarable. Not to the same extent as lead, but pretty common. Medical devices in particular have a lot of challenges because of all the silicone parts. Now, if you are in our monthly or quarterly update service where we sit down every month like this, except for it's interactive. This is not as interactive. You're going to put in questions, which is awesome, and I'll get to the end. And what's much more interactive when we talk about your product. Hey, we make this product. So we talk about these changes and how they impact your products and then how to handle it. But as part of that, it's a newer thing, and not everybody who works with us in these updates have received these yet because they're brand new, is the idea for each SVHC update, we provide you a reference declaration. One of the challenges is, if there's new one you have to do work on, you have to often justify it to someone else who's doing the work. One of the fundamental rules of restricted materials compliance is the restricted materials prime can do anything they want as long as it's free. But doing work or spending effort normally isn't. So you need to justify it. So you need to say, hey, we have to work on TNPP. Furthermore, which is even harder, is proving something doesn't exist. So if you say, hey, we don't have to do any work because the January 2020 list has no high-risk SVHCs, they're not any reasonable belief they'll be in our products, about 0.1% by weight. So what do you do now? How do you put that in your compliance system? So we provide one of these that says low risk, low risk, low risk, and you reference this in your compliance system and why you didn't do any work on this update. A bunch of caveats, of course, usual, where it's amazing how creative people get sometimes to find a really creative use for anything. But this is through a lot of research, and we do a lot of pre-testing of product actually now before even the SVHC makes the list, like we do with PFPS. So anybody who does a quarterly or monthly update service will be getting these. They'll be rolled out a bit slowly because we double and triple check them, but it's a newer addition to that work. Moving on from REACH, we have also the RoHS recast phthalate edition, which has been, most electronics were in scope of the phthalate restriction July 21st, 2019. The medical devices, IVD, and monitoring control come into scope next year. So still a lot of work usually to do for them. What are the phthalates for? These orthophthalates, they act as a liquid that gets in between the different vinyl chloride strands in PVC or other materials, pushes the vinyl chloride strands farther apart. By pushing the vinyl chloride strands farther apart, they reduce the bonds of attraction between the PVC strands. It's like magnets, you push them farther apart, their bonds of attraction become weaker, they become more fluid relative to each other, you can move them around more, and therefore creates flexibility. So they're a fluid that doesn't react or become part of the polymer, gets in between the strands and forces them farther apart. So they create flexibility. Really common in flexible PVC, but also neoprene, which is polychloroprene, nitrile rubber, styrene butadiene rubber, and certain adhesives. Normally when we find it's very high concentration, 50, 100,000 plus ppm. It doesn't really do anything useful unless it's in high concentration. The exception is when it comes in as a colorant. It can be much lower concentration because it's coming in as the plasticizer and the colorant, not the base plastic resin. So we'll see lower levels, a couple thousand ppm when it comes in through the colorant. Very, very, very common material. You'll find it in wire and cables, strain relief, O-rings, gaskets. If you have a sealed radial bearing, so if you have shielded radial bearing, there's a metal shield on it. If it's sealed, it's a neoprene seal. PVC stickers, synthetic leather, vinyl, dust covers, all this vinyl, PVC, neoprene, nitrile rubber, SBR, motor belts, fan belts, all those sort of things will be plasticized Historically, almost always orthophthalate, now potentially one of the longer chain orthophthalates, which are only Prop 65, or the terephtalates, which basically do the same job. One of the things you have to look at for RoHS and what you do, if whatever you do, data gathering, engineering assessment, whatever, ends up with a product with no non-compliant parts, awesome. But if you do get a non-compliant part, which happens all the time, because the supplier failure error rate's about 0.5%. They get RoHS wrong about 0.5% of the time, which if your product is over more than 200 parts, which means more that product will be non-compliant about half the time. So it happens all the time. Key thing is to understand their enforcement process. They have two enforcement metrics. What was the magnitude of the offense? Basically, how much restricted material did you expose the recycling worker? RoHS is around safety of the recycling worker, not the user. Did you expose the recycling worker to? For example, I had a lead solder, 100,000 circuit boards, which is over 1 ton a year of lead. We're talking about a large exposure. Or I had hexachrome on 1,000 screws. It's about 1 milligram of hexachrome. Very small exposure to the recycling worker. However, did the hexachrome failure come because we didn't do any testing? Could we? But if you made a big error, but you've tested everything and you found it yourself and you identified it, there's basically no penalty for it. One of the biggest metrics is against the value of your sales in that jurisdiction. Could you or should you have done more testing? Basically, if you did testing, would it have significantly impacted the purchase price of the product? If not, they have no sympathy. They say, hey, I got supplier data. They're used to dealing with low-cost suppliers, products who have low-cost suppliers, and they always have it. Their supplier said it was fine, so they really don't care what the supplier said. After the 100th time they've been told, the supplier said it was okay. They're like, did you test anything? So if nothing's ever wrong with your product, awesome, testing doesn't matter. However, if something goes wrong, which happens all the time, as long as you test it, there's really no penalty. That's a very, very important part of this whole thing. We'll talk about conformity assessments. Awesome, you can use any method you wish to assess conformity, but then you have to manage the risk of it being non-compliant. And against the value of your product, it's right in RoHS and in the Blue Guide. Against the value of your product, if you didn't do enough testing or potentially auditing, but they prefer testing against the value of your product, they don't have any sympathy when things go wrong. So a very important question occurs in the event of reporting of basically every enforcement action involved in, which is many. RoHS is generally behind closed doors and takes actually a long period of time. But they basically look, and if you ever do a questionnaire for when you self-report, there's always a question about looking at the value of your sales. Could you have done more testing? What could you have done to prevent this? And that's a key one. So they'll ask how much in weight. So they'll always ask you to calculate how much lead is involved. And then should you have done more testing? Of course, when you're saying, hey, we found it in our own testing, awesome, there's really no penalty at that point in time. And the metric is against value, not volume. So against the value of your sales, if you did more testing, would it have significantly changed the purchasing price of your product? If not, they don't have a lot of sympathy. And this could be any jurisdiction. It's not just RoHS. This is Canada for SCCPs, etc. So against medical, most products have had to be in scope of the phthalate restrictions July 21st, 2019. Medical IVD monitor control is next year. Testing is the most effective method to ensure compliance. We can't say, well, I got this big product, I can't test everything. There are practical approaches. The idea is to have the testing to show your process worked, especially for legacy products. New products, people often test anyways because they have a compliance budget when the product is being designed. And you sit down and say, hey, what compliance standards we have to meet? Here's the ones we'll have to do for safety. Here's the ones for EMC. Here's the one for Bluetooth. Here's the one for restricted materials. And when they come out of pre-manufacturing, they need the test report for it. And it makes life a lot easier. Legacy doesn't have the same kind of budgets. You have to be strategic. You normally test something representative. Newish REACH restriction. So REACH has SVHC, which are declaration requirements, which go in the SCIP database. There's also restrictions in there. Most of the time, a lot of companies don't realize that because there's overlap with other regulations. Cadmium restriction in plastics is basically a duplicate in cadmium and RoHS. But nickel and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, pHs, are restricted in prolonged human contact. So wearables. And the new PFOA restriction. So these are actually restrictions, not just REACH declarables. Unlike Article 33 or SVHC, these are restrictions. The big one coming up is PFOA. It's a REACH 67 restriction. It kicks in July 2020. It's actually moving to the persistent organic pollutant regulation. It's moving from one regulation to another. It's just a matter of publishing the move. The legislation is complete. It's restricted to 25 parts per billion, not million, which brings into play not just waterproof coatings, but PTFE, PVDF, FEP, FKM, so Teflon, Viton, etc. If they've used PFOA as a processing aid, they're non-compliant. Now, there's many processing aids these ones can use. They don't have PFOA, but if they use PFOA, it's a restriction. There is some exclusions. Invasive and implantable medical devices have until 2020 or 2025. Other medical devices don't. There's a few specialized uses in the semiconductor industry. So there's a number of minor exclusions and exemptions, but otherwise everything else in scope. This restriction applies to everything. It's an RoHS restriction, except for instead of 1,000 parts per million, it's 25 parts per billion. It's a different scaling. So this is a restriction that kicks in July 2020. Medical device regulation, big one coming up. If your product is invasive or fluid and gas path contacting, if it has a category 1 is known to cause a CMR, cancer, mutation, or reproductive harm, or it's an endocrine disruptor to human health, which is a bit redundant because every single endocrine disruptor to human health is also a category 1 reproductive toxin. So it's really category 1 CMRs right now. If you have that in a fluid, gas, or invasive material, you have to label it and justify its use if it's above 0.1% by weight. So there's a whole bunch of steps, identifying it, justifying it, and then the guidelines for justification and the labeling requirement. I'm not going to go that in detail, and it's around materials that are invasive and come in direct contact with the human body, either and touch or store liquids or gases going into the body. If they have a category 1 CMR or an endocrine disrupting chemical to human health of 0.1% by weight, they need to label it and justify it as part of their EU MDR compliance. Now, a lot of people have different approaches. Data gathering for EU MDR, it could theoretically work sometimes. The only reason it could actually work is the fact that a lot of medical device materials don't have commonly category 1 CMRs. And so whether or not you tried, however well the data gathering worked, it just doesn't happen to have anything in it. The supplier data is somewhat limited, especially the understanding. We see lots of supplier data inaccuracies. It's also very slow. We find not slow for, hey, this supplier got back to me right away, slow to complete. In a lot of ways, we don't care if you have half the data. That's not compliant. You need all of it. So it's not generally that effective. Supplier data gathering, and we've done lots in our past, it's very depressing how ineffective it is. Testing is pretty darn good. It's relatively fast. You have a consistent timeline. It'll be done from here and finished then. It's accurate, provides data. We do lots of MDR testing, provides confidence that, yes, this is what we have. It's amazing how many times we get a bomb and then test it, and they're not the same materials, let alone restricted materials. They just aren't the same materials. It's strangely common. Now, a lot of fluid and gas paths aren't too bad at being consistent, but we get surprised still a lot. It just works. It solves the problem, which is our big fans. One thing we don't like about data gathering, it may not solve the problem. And we might not know it doesn't solve the problem until too late. We like testing because it solves the problem. Cons, you have to have a need of physical sample. There are only a handful of labs that are qualified to do this, including us. We've been audited 6 to 8 times by medical companies and regulatory bodies and standards councils, and it's a lot. It's very detailed because you have all these, depending how you count it, hundreds, if not 1,000 EU MDR substances, and you need a solution path for each. And so we have a quite detailed plan to go through screening, because a lot of MDR materials can be screened out through one technique or another, and then very specific chemical tests, very specific ones that are identified during screening. It can be costly, but often you're only doing it for a small number of parts. Usually the amount of parts that are fluid or gas or invasive are small. And it's just effective. Especially right now, people are looking down the barrel. It's a May deadline. I really need to get this done. Our testing is one of the best ways to go. You know what? We used to offer data gathering. It's not that we don't, and we use it very specifically for specific stuff like batteries and such still. One thing we didn't like about it is it just doesn't work. The testing works. We find the data gathering just doesn't work, especially not consistently or predictably. It's a big part of it, or truthfully. Now since we have, for some time had a fairly good and large test laboratory, we can see the difference. Where the point is, we don't trust the compliance rate of supplier declarations. It's just not. If this is our client's product to be registered for medical device, supplier data gathering just doesn't cut it. Not in our confidence point of view. So again, deadline is May 26, 2020. That said, if it's a legacy product still under MDD certificate, it has until the end of its certificate before it has to apply. Getting close to the deadline. If you're still stuck, we can help. And meanwhile, causing problems with all the MDR stuff going on, cobalt is reclassified as a Category 1 carcinogen. It's just a matter of publicizing it now. Once it does, it's not officially a carcinogen, Category 1, for 18 months. So sometime late 2022, barring anything unforeseen happening, cobalt will be EU MDR regulated, which drags in stainless steel. Virtually all stainless steels have cobalt between 0.1 and 0.2%. It's basically the spec is under 0.2, but almost always ends up being between 0.1 and 0.2. When it says under 0.2, it means it's there. And that brings in virtually every stainless steel into labeling and justification for MDR. Now, there is a lot of lobbying work going on by the US and steel industry to say, did you really mean cobalt and stainless steel? But in absence of anything else happening, cobalt, sometime late 2022, will be EU MDR regulated. So all that stainless steel in the invasive gas or fluid path will very likely have cobalt labeling and justification requirements. Now, it doesn't say that there won't be something that's done about it in between, for sure. But right now, without anything done about it, or any other changes legislation, that's the pathway it's on. Now, I'm going to move this part really quickly because this is actually a really complicated topic. Canada. If you're going to look at restricted materials up here in North America, at a federal level, it's going to be in Canada. And it's not going to be things that hurt humans. Substances that cause human health harm have a very difficult or high bar to meet in Canada and the US. So it's very difficult to get regulation something that hurts somebody. So if it causes reproductive harm or ovarian cysts or attention deficit or osteoporosis, very unlikely to be restricted. Bioaccumulants are quite different. If you can show persistence in bioaccumulation, they're easy to restrict. So most of the ones you can see here are bioaccumulants. There's a whole bunch of steps in it. One of the first steps is they get put on Schedule 1, the toxic substances list. And this is where a lot of companies go sideways. Oh, so the toxic substances list in Canada means it's restricted. No, it's really weird. They should be good at English, but it's very hard to understand. It's basically, once it meets Schedule 1, it's basically now been approved for work to be done to see if we should manage the risk of it. Being on Schedule 1 doesn't mean any restriction whatsoever. It means they've agreed they should spend money to look at what they should do about it. Then there's the risk management measures where they have consultations about its use and risk and figure out whether they should do something about it. If so, what should they really do? And if restriction occurs, it ends up being the Canadian prohibition of certain toxic substances. And that's where the restrictions are, the Canadian prohibition. So Schedule 1 are not restrictions. They're the list of substances they're going to do some work on. The Canadian prohibition is the restriction list. And that's where you see the restrictions. Currently, there are a number of substances on it, but in real-world practicality, for physical products, it's just short-chain chlorinated alkanes, which is called SCCPs, or short-chain chlorinated paraffins everywhere else. They're banned in the EU and banned in Canada. They're regularly enforced by Environment Canada. They'll actually contact you and show up on your premises with a badge and such. They're quite stringent about it. One of the things you don't hear about it is they keep it behind closed doors and deal with it directly with the manufacturer or retailer. It's roughly a 1,500 ppm limit. It's a little weird in Canada because it's trace. When in doubt, the UN and the EU have 1,500 ppm as the trace limit for SCCPs. Lots of argument one way or another. But a lot of companies just use the European limit. Often when they're working with Asia, they have to communicate a number, not a hand-wavy idea of trace, and people use 1,500 ppm. Super common. It's the secondary plasticizer that comes with DHP phthalate. Even RoHS compliant products, we find it all the time because we find it in the twist tie or the carrying bag or something similar. In expensive products, we find it in the wire and cable and everything. It's all over the place. When we test twist ties for SCCPs, because they're normally flexible PVC, but 1 in 3 twist ties fails for SCCPs, which is a recall in Canada or recall in Europe. That's currently what's regulated. Coming up, there are 5 more groupings that are about to be restricted. They're either at the publication point of view or have one more consultation to do before publication. So none of the dates are final yet because none of them are published, but they're all on that path. The PFOA, PFOS family, the perfluorooctanoic acids, and so on and so forth, they're basically banned in manufactured items, physical products. We don't know the limit yet. It should be published late 2020. If they use the European limit, it'll basically restrict the processing aids for Teflon, PTF, FKM, FEP, and PVDF, not the fluoropolymers themselves. We just can't use PFOA or PFOS as the processing aid. Actually, the main source of PFOA is makeup, where women's makeup, underlayer makeup that says it's silky, it's actually a PFOA phosphate. And the reason it's silky is you're literally coating your skin with Teflon, which makes it pretty darn slippery. And that's the main source of PFOA out there right now. So it's not published yet, but they've agreed to do it. So unless something unforeseen happens by late 2020, it should be published in the Gazette, with the restriction likely kicking in 2022 or so. So it's pretty well a done deal, but anything still can happen. We're looking at a potential restriction maybe around 2022. decaBDE, which is the only RoHS PBD that we ever find, it's basically been agreed upon to restrict in physical products. The publication will likely be in 2020, with the restriction going into effect probably late 2022, but we'll see. It'll likely be a 0.1% by weight, which is the same as RoHS. It was relatively common in thin plastics. It works in antimony trioxide as a synergist to make thin plastics very flame retardant. We don't see it that often anymore, especially RoHS compliant, but it basically brings in some of the RoHS substances into Canada. But Canada is not a huge market, but most companies don't want a different product in Canada versus the US. So it kind of drags their US products into this compliance. HBCDDs use the flame retardant, extruded polystyrene, expanded polystyrene. It's been SVHC for a long, long time. We've never seen it. So it's pretty low risk. It's pretty well a done deal to be published as a restriction in 2020, probably start being restricted in 2022. Now, the next two are one stage away. They all have to go through another consultation, but they're pretty far along the restriction path. One is Dechlorane Plus, which is another common flame retardant for EBDM, heat shrink, and nylon. We don't see it that often. It is a REACH SVHC, so it's otherwise regulated. It'll probably be banned around 0.1% by weight in manufactured items. They'll probably publish the restriction late 2021, with the restriction going into place probably 2023. This will have some impact, but we see this chemical infrequently. This is the one that's going to be a problem, DBDPE, decabromodiphenylethane. It is the drop-in replacement for decaBDE. It's not regulated anywhere else, so there's no other impetus to ban it. It has another consultation to do, so it probably won't be restricted. The publication's restriction likely won't be till late 2021, with the earliest restriction probably 2023. It's a very common replacement for decaBDE. It's really common in heat shrink and small connectors. When we test for it, we find it about 1 in 3 times in high-risk materials. It's very common. This one is more likely to trigger a product redesign, this restriction. Now, we're still looking probably the 2023 timeframe, so it's time. And so in 2020, the things you have to work for in 2020, we try to look at not only what you have to work directly on, but also what you have to budget for next year. Part of your work during the year is budgeting. Again, Restricted Materials Prime can do anything they want as long as it's free. Doing work like this is not. So part of your work for this year will obviously be budgeting for work you can do the following year. So back to the deadline chart. I'm going to get to questions in a second. Most companies should have moved through the UAE registration where applicable. Big one coming up first this year is the EU MDR deadline in May, and then the PFOA restriction for everybody, except for invasive medical devices, in July. The SCIP Database submission deadline, Jan 5th, 2021. The medical device monitoring control entering the RoHS phthalate restrictions in mid-2021. And then still not quite clear if cobalt continues its path towards being a carcinogen, which is basically a matter of publication right now. All the levels of government, parliament, council, and commission have agreed it's expected to go through. Unless some sort of exemption happens for stainless steel, it's going to have a big impact on medical devices late 2023 and their EU MDR compliance. It'll involve stainless steel, by and large, needing labeling and justification due to its cobalt content. And then probably at the end of 2022, we'll start seeing the first of the new set, like PFOA and decaBDE Canadian restrictions. The really important ones, DBDPE, will likely be late 2023. So again, everybody will attend. It'll receive a copy of the presentation, and there'll be a recording available the next couple days. And right now, I'll try to get to as many questions as I can. Sorry I was going so quickly. Again, everybody will receive a copy, which is a lot of material to go through. Does lead and high temperature solders need to be entered? Yes, lead and high temp solder is a lead in an alloy, so it counts as lead metal, so it's a lead for the point of view of SVHC. Some theoretically reportable REACH SVHC substances, lead monoxide, diboron trioxide, etc., are not present in the original molecular form of electronics that are part of a UVCB. So for people following this, UVCB is unknown variable composition of biological. Multiple players in the supply chain make disclaimers to this effect. However, the formula is always glass, lead frit, substrates, capacitors. We're wondering if this is applicable as a general rule or ceramic base material. So this is I didn't really read that very well. Very common in the SVHC, where lead oxide is used to make leaded glass, whether optical glass or whether is one of the layers in a thick film resistor or diode. The industry statement on it is now leaded glass, which is a different CAS number. The lead under REACH is lead, not lead and lead compounds. So RoHS is lead and lead compounds. It's lead, therefore it's only lead metal. So leaded glass is a different chemical, and it is not an SVHC. Ceramics are a bit complicated, because if the ceramic is the SVHC, so lead, zirconate, titanate, PZT is a ceramic, and it is an SVHC, it's declarable because the actual ceramic or glass is the SVHC, as opposed to having lead as part of the CAS number. So this is true also for diboron trioxide. Diboron trioxide is an ingredient to make borosilicate glass, which is one of the main layers FR4 circuit board. The diboron trioxide doesn't exist anymore. Now it's borosilicate glass. It's chemically quite different, actually, and no longer exists. Another one you're going to see is PFBS, which is a January 2020 REACH SVHC. It is a common halogen-free. I know it's got fluorine in it. It's not halogen-free, but from an industry perspective, for some reason, fluorine is not a halogen, even though if you kind of a chemistry degree, kind of says that column is halogens. So a halogen-free flame retardant, PFBS, for polycarbonate, it fully reacts with the polycarbonate and becomes polycarbonate strand, and it is no longer PFBS. And if we try to do an extraction test of it, and we've done that to prove the point, the PFBS doesn't come out. We end up with like 50 ppm residual, not the couple thousand or 5,000 ppm that was there originally. So there are a lot of rules around REACH SVHCs. One of the key ones is leaded glass is not lead or lead oxide from a REACH SVHC point of view. One of the questions I don't really understand. Oh, good. Somebody's asking a bunch of questions about the spreadsheet. They kind of solved it. It's all way it's all attached together is we put each product as a column, and then we create it links to separate components, and we reuse the same components over and over again. So for brass, if a part is coated with nickel, it means lead in the brass does not come in contact with the hand. Holding a nickel-coated product is a different issue, but lead is not in contact with the skin. Okay, so lead in brass that's nickel-coated. We'll assume the nickel coating is good, because the most common RoHS compliance issue we're seeing right now is cadmium or lead in the nickel coating, because nickel often needs an antioxidant to be bright when it's coated on, and some of the lead or nickel gets coated onto the part, and we end up with RoHS non-compliance because of lead or brass in the lead or cadmium in the nickel coating. So imagine the nickel's good, and it's around the brass is leaded. You still have to declare the SVHC, because lead and brass over the coated part will still be above 0.1% by weight. You may change your safe use instructions if you believe hand contact is not an issue. That's safe use instructions. For California Proposition 65, you do the wipe test. If it's a wearable, it's actually a little bit different test. A wearable has to go through basically a tumbler test. But if it's casual contact, it's a wipe test for Prop 65, see if the lead comes out. For REACH SVHC, they don't care. They only care if it's there. If you believe they don't come in contact with the lead, which can be solved through a simple wipe test, then you don't necessarily have to use the same safe use instruction because there isn't the same exposure. But our SVHC doesn't care whether it's skin exposure or not, whether you have to declare it. It does care. That's interesting. It does care for safe use instructions. You can change your safe use instructions depending on the exposure, but whether you have to declare it or not is not affected by whether or not you can touch it. If my company builds a product that contains an SVHC over the threshold and sells this assembly to a US company, if this company then sells as part of the EU, who is responsible for fill and skip? It's a bit complicated. So at the end of the day, if you're placing on the market a product in the EU, in this case, either means finished product or you bring in a component for sale in the EU by itself, the one who first passes through customs, clear from customs, is responsible for ensuring the SCIP submission is complete. So the one holding the bag at the end of the day is the company that imports it and clears from custom in Europe, whether it's the finished product or if you're selling components like resistors, the resistor, if you're selling it on the open market. If the resistor isn't part of a product that's brought in, it's the company that brings in the product that's responsible. Now, they may need technical information from you, like REACH SVHC information, but the one who's legally on the hook is the one that brings it in, which might also be a distributor. They will likely need the manufacturer of the product to do the work, and the component manufacturers may have to provide information, but that's a business event. The one that's ultimately responsible is the one that imports into the EU. If the SCIP declaration is not done when it is needed, then it can't be imported into the EU. So it's a bit of a complicated. Good question about the supply deck. Everybody who attended will receive a copy. They do, especially this morning, to the sheer number of people attended. It's going to take us a little while to get it all out. But everybody should the next day or two get all of the presentation. If SVHC is found on a component, we have several of the same components on our PCB, with the result of the SVHC reported as the cumulative or reported as per part commodity. You would report it per part, however, other than maybe connectors or buzzers, you shouldn't have a lot of SVHCs in your circuit board because leaded glass is not an SVHC, so thick film resistors, diodes, etc., are not SVHCs. You would just do the number of. So imagine we have lead in our connectors and we have 3 connectors. So you just go, you create a connector that identifies as lead in it, and the product identifies that it contains 3 of those. That's it. EU MDR question. If you're developing a new product, you have to wait until you have your design developed, complete, and the final version of prototypes in order to test check for EU MDR, or you can do it earlier. Actually, this goes for all restricted materials. There is depending on what you're doing, you want restricted materials to be part of your design process, whether you test or not during, but you want to know at least when you're asking or picking apart what it has to comply to. So when you do get the product done, when you test it, that it doesn't fail. So we definitely recommend having a spec on what the part should have be used in your product. Now for EU MDR, if you're concerned, testing during so it doesn't get rejected later. And often when we have a prototype, not the finished version, it's worthwhile testing and then potentially testing the 1 or 2 parts that are different later. You want to do what works best for your compliance process. Definitely, we recommend for all restricted materials, is you have a specification so when the designers are picking something, they know what it has to meet, so it's less likely to be rejected later. In terms of when you test, it's a really good question. Depends what makes sense. Usually right at the end. However, often we test people's prototypes. They make 2 or 3 changes, and we just test those changes. Many ROHS exemptions are coming up to the due date. Are there concerns about 6A, B, or C not being extended? So the way it works is in 2021, a number of exemptions have a renewal deadline, which really means a year beforehand, they have to start the renewal process. So in 2020, most of the main exemptions have already started a renewal process. What's going to happen to them is completely dictated by the submissions that go. So if you're worried about it, make a submission why it's technically needed, why the replacements don't work as well, and what the concerns are. 6A, B, and C should be extended. It's whether or not they'll be further refined. Further refined means less and less. What they want to do is, if they extend it, they want to reduce the scope. They want to say, hey, less in galvanized steel compared to machine steel, which is not a typical situation. And that'll be completely dictated by what people submit. They can only use what people submit. So if it's needed for a reason, you have to keep track of people submitted for that reason. They'll normally agree to any reasonable justification as long as you go through, you check the boxes, but that has to happen. All 3 of 6A, B, and C are expected to be renewed. It's whether or not they'll be refined at all is a good question. The copper one's the hardest one to refine because it's a very generalized usage, as opposed to steel, where its leaded use is 2 different things, machine and galvanization. They're 2 totally separate things. So they're expected to be renewed, but the renewal will be completely dictated by what is asked for. You're justified. For RoHS 3 deadline, are active implantable devices still exempt, or does that exemption go away? Yes, active implantable is still exempt from RoHS. I'm trying to remember. If I'm wrong, I will correct myself later. Wouldn't be the first time. I'm trying to reread text in my head. But it should be still excluded. If they're excluded from the original RoHS, they're still excluded now. If they've been excluded for the last couple of years, they're still excluded now. This is just change in the materials restrictions, not in the scope of the legislation. That's it for today. I'm going over time. I apologize. Again, there should be there'll be a version of this sent to everybody, and there'll be a recording available for download pretty soon, and hopefully a YouTube version where I won't be going quite as fast, or I will be going quite as fast, but you can scroll it back. It's one of the great things about YouTube. Thanks again for attending, and I look forward to hosting everyone again soon. And if you need help with any of these, especially SCIP or EU MDR, we're here to help. When in doubt, if you just want to ask a question, saying, hey, I'm doing this, or I have these 50,000 parts, how do I do it? Ask us, we can help. You're not the first. There are a lot of people going through it too. That's great again. Talk to everyone again soon.